What if the most terrible secret you ever kept wasn't yours? For over 50 years, I carried a monster's legacy inside my own body, a truth so vile it was meant to die with me. But my husband, the man who swore to protect me, was the one who demanded my silence. He told me to be the bigger person, to bury the horror and smile for the neighbors. This is the story of how that silence almost consumed me, and how, in the end, I learned that the only way to be bigger is to burn the whole rotten thing to the ground. If you believe that secrets need a voice, follow my story. Like, share, and hit that notification bell, because the quietest houses often hide the loudest screams. I'm Lily. 78 years have passed over my head, and for the last 3 of them, this house has been quiet. It's a silence that has teeth. It's been 3 years since my husband Robert's heart finally gave out, leaving me alone with the ghosts he and I created together. The silence isn't an absence of sound. Oh no, it's a presence. It's a thick, heavy blanket woven from every word that was never spoken, every scream that was swallowed, every question that was never dared to be asked. It fills the spaces between the floorboards and hangs in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sun. I can feel it settling on my skin, a fine layer of unspoken history. Robert had a saying for every difficult occasion. "We have to be the bigger people, Lily." He'd say it with a firm, placid confidence that I used to mistake for strength. He said it when the neighbor's dog dug up my petunias, when a business partner shortchanged him, and when his own mother made a cutting remark about my cooking at Thanksgiving. Be bigger, rise above, don't make a scene. It was his gospel, the foundational text of our life together. I look at our wedding photograph on the mantelpiece, its silver frame now tarnished at the edges, much like the memory it holds. There he is, impossibly young, his chest puffed out with a handsome, uncomplicated pride, and there I am beside him, my dress a cloud of white lace, a smile pinned to my lips. But if you look closely, if you really look, you can see it. The smile doesn't touch my eyes. My eyes are already looking somewhere else, somewhere just past the camera, as if searching for an escape route. I was already learning to be bigger then, learning to swell my lungs with things other than air, learning to make room. What Robert never understood, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, is that a person can be made so large with secrets and pain that they are hollowed out from the inside. You become a vast, echoing chamber, a walking mausoleum. Your own ribs become the soaring arches of a cathedral built to house a single, terrible relic. Your heart becomes the cold stone sarcophagus. And you carry it all with you, every day, the sheer, crushing weight of it disguised by a polite smile and a neatly pressed dress. My story isn't about the specters of the dead. It's far more mundane and far more terrifying. It's about the monster who lived right next door, the one who smiled and waved from behind his perfectly manicured lawn. And it's about the man who slept beside me every night for 50 years, the man who held my hand in public and then, in the suffocating privacy of our bedroom, asked me to pretend the monster wasn't there. Once, a long, long time ago, our little town of Willow Creek, Ohio, felt like the safest place on earth. It was a postcard of American wholesomeness, a place of neatly trimmed privet hedges, Sunday church services where attendance was an unspoken requirement, and a constant rotating potluck of shared casseroles that served as both currency and social surveillance. It was a town that believed in the inherent goodness of its people, a belief so strong it became a kind of willful blindness. We moved there in the spring, when the dogwoods were in bloom and the air was sweet with the promise of a good life. Our neighbor, the man in the house just across a thin line of sculpted boxwoods, was Frank Miller. To Willow Creek, Frank was not just a man, he was an institution. He was handsome in that rugged, dependable way that people in the Midwest admire. He was charismatic, with a slow, easy smile that could disarm the most cynical soul. And most importantly, he was a widower, a tragic, noble figure whom everyone pitied and admired in equal measure for his perceived strength. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away from a sudden illness some years before we arrived. The town spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, a sainted figure in Willow Creek's local mythology. Frank, they said, bore his grief with incredible dignity. He was a pillar at the First Presbyterian Church, always the first to volunteer for the bake sale or to help repair a leaking roof. He was a trusted friend to my husband, Robert. They'd spend Saturday afternoons talking over the fence, Robert leaning on his rake, Frank with his pruning shears, discussing property taxes and the pitiful state of the Cleveland Browns. They were two pillars of the community, a portrait of respectable, middle-aged masculinity. Not long after we moved in, a woman from the church auxiliary, a Mrs. Gable with a helmet of sprayed solid hair, cornered me by the punch bowl at a social. She patted my arm with a dry, papery hand. "Oh, Lily, my dear," she'd chirped, her eyes darting between me and Frank, who was holding court across the room. "Has anyone ever told you, you have a touch of Eleanor about you? It's the way you hold your head so poised. And your smile." I remember feeling a strange little flutter of pride. It felt like a compliment, an acceptance into this tight-knit community. I was being compared to a saint. I glanced over at Frank, and he happened to be looking my way. He gave me a small, sad, appreciative smile. I smiled back, a gesture of sympathy. I used to think it was a compliment, a harmless, small-town observation. Now I know it was a curse. It was the moment I was selected. Frank's friendliness wasn't kindness, it was a performance. His entire life was a performance. He was a master of social taxidermy, stuffing and mounting the perfect persona for the town to admire. His charm was the varnish, his sad stories the carefully worded plaque, his smile the lifeless glass eye. And I, with my unfortunate resemblance to his late wife, was to be his next project, his masterpiece. The violation didn't happen in a dark alley, cloaked in the kind of overt menace you see in movies. It happened on a warm summer evening, under a sky full of stars, surrounded by the laughter and chatter of our friends and neighbors. It happened in the deceptive safety of his pristine, picture-perfect home. We'd all been at a community barbecue in his backyard. Tiki torches flickered, casting dancing shadows on the manicured lawn. The air smelled of charcoal, sweet corn, and cheap beer. It was the epitome of Willow Creek's manufactured bliss. As the party began to wind down, and Robert was helping another neighbor load a cooler into his car, Frank approached me. He had that gentle, almost paternal smile on his face. "Lily," he said, his voice a low, pleasant hum. "The party's not quite over for you. You must come inside for a moment. I've made a pitcher of my grandmother's special lemonade. It's a family secret." He turned to Robert, who had just walked up. "Robert, you don't mind if I steal your lovely wife for just a moment, do you?" "I'd love for her to try this recipe." Robert clapped Frank on the shoulder, laughing. "Of course not, Frank. Go on, honey. Take care of her for me." The words, so innocent then, would later echo in my mind like a death knell. Take care of her. I followed him into his house. It was immaculate, just as you'd expect. Everything was in its place, polished and dust-free. It smelled faintly of lemon oil, and something else, something I couldn't place. He led me to the kitchen and poured a tall, sweating glass of pale yellow liquid. The ice clinked musically against the glass. "To good neighbors," he said, raising his own glass. I took a long drink. It was delicious, and incredibly sweet. Sickly sweet. I remember thinking that, just for a second, before the first wave of dizziness hit me. The edges of the pristine kitchen began to blur, the overhead light seeming to pulse and dim. Frank's face swam in and out of focus, his smile looking distorted, wider. "Are you all right, Lily?" His voice seemed to come from a great distance. The world went fuzzy, then dark, a sickening lurch, like falling down a well. When I came to, it wasn't in his bright, sterile kitchen. I was on a cold, damp concrete floor. The air was thick and cloying with the smell of chemicals, a sharp, biting scent like formaldehyde mixed with damp earth and something metallic. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire overhead, casting long, monstrous shadows. I was in his basement. My head throbbed, a dull, heavy ache, and my body felt disconnected from my mind, a leaden weight I couldn't command. It wasn't the physical act that shattered me most profoundly. In truth, the details of that are a merciful blur, a dark, confusing fog of pain and helplessness. No, The true horror, the part that carved itself into the marrow of my bones, was the aftermath. He wasn't frenzied or enraged. He was clinical. His movements were precise, unhurried, like a surgeon or a botanist tending to a specimen. He adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose, his face a mask of detached concentration. He held a strange, needle-like instrument. It wasn't a hypodermic needle like a doctor would use. It was thicker, more industrial, with a small reservoir attached. It gleamed unnervingly in the dim light. He leaned in close, so close I could feel his cool, even breath on my cheek. He didn't raise his voice. He whispered, the words a venomous secret meant only for me. "A woman's purpose is to carry things," he murmured, his voice calm, almost academic. "It is your nature. You carry life. You carry secrets. You carry burdens for men who are too weak to bear them themselves. It is your great, silent strength." He brought the strange instrument closer. My body was too heavy to recoil. I could only watch, a prisoner in my own skin. "But you won't carry a child of my blood," he continued, his whisper dropping even lower, laced with a terrifying proprietary pride. "That would be too simple, too common. No, you will carry my truth now. Not a child of flesh and blood, but a child of my making. A testament, my legacy, carved not in stone, but in the most secret, sacred place there is, a permanent record." I didn't understand the words, not then. The meaning was a locked door. But I understood the tone, the chilling finality of it. I felt a sharp, piercing pain, a violation far deeper than the physical. I knew, with a certainty that eclipsed all the confusion, that I had been fundamentally remade. He had planted something inside me, something horrible and foreign. I was no longer just Lily. I had been turned into a vessel for his monstrous truth. I don't know how long I was down there. Time had dissolved into a thick, chemical-smelling haze. Eventually, the basement door opened, and he was gone. The strength, or maybe just the sheer terror, returned to my limbs in a painful flood. I stumbled up the stairs, out his back door, and across the manicured lawn that separated our two homes. The night air was cool on my skin, but I felt a burning internal fever. Each step was a monumental effort, my body a war zone of confusion, violation, and a pain I had no name for. The world felt tilted, unreal. The familiar shape of my own house looked like a stranger's. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 attempts to get it into the lock. The click of the tumbler echoed in the silent house. Robert was in the living room, reading the paper under his favorite lamp, a small pool of yellow light in the darkness. He looked up, his expression mild, annoyed. "Lily, where have you been?" I was starting to get worried. And then it all came out. It wasn't a coherent narrative. It was a torrent, a flood of horror and tears and fragmented images, the words tumbling out of me faster than I could form them. "Robert, Frank," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "His house. The lemonade. I think he put something in it. I woke up. Robert, I woke up in his basement." I was sobbing now, great ragged breaths that felt like they were tearing my lungs apart. The floor was so cold. He had this thing, a needle, and he said things, terrible things. He whispered. He said I had to carry his truth. Robert, he did something to me. I waited for him to rush to me, to hold me, to share my horror. I waited for the righteous anger, the protective fury of a husband. It never came. He just looked at me. His face, which had been placid moments before, went pale. But it wasn't the pallor of empathy. It was the stark white pallor of fear. A cold, selfish fear. He slowly folded his newspaper, placing it precisely on the end table beside his armchair. His movements were deliberate, as if trying to impose order on the chaos I had just unleashed into his quiet evening. "Lily," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You had too much wine at the barbecue. Everyone saw you. You're not making any sense. Frank is our friend. No, I cried, my voice cracking. It wasn't the wine. This was real. I'm telling you the truth. I took a step towards him, my hand outstretched, pleading. That's when his fear turned to anger. It was a swift, terrifying transformation. He stood up, his body rigid. He strode across the room and grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging into my flesh. His face was inches from mine, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic need for me to be wrong. "Stop this," he hissed, his voice a low, vicious command. "Just stop it. Do you have any idea what you are saying?" Do you have any idea what an accusation like this would do to us? To our name in this town? Frank Miller? He's on the town council, for God's sake. He's my friend. He's everyone's friend. An accusation. It would destroy everything we've built here. Our business, our life. They would laugh at us. Or worse. He was shaking me slightly, as if he could physically shake the truth out of my head. I stared back at him, the tears freezing on my face, a cold dread washing over me that was even more profound than the horror I'd felt in Frank's basement. And then came the words that would become the bars of my cage for the next 50 years, the words that were my life sentence. He let go of my shoulders and took a step back, running a hand through his hair as if to smooth down his own panic. He looked at me, not as his wife, not as a victim, but as a problem to be managed. "Listen to me, Lily," he said, his voice now taking on that familiar, firm tone of his. The bigger person tone. Even if something did happen, even if you aren't just confused, we have to be the bigger people. We rise above it. We do not speak of this again, not to anyone, not even to each other. We swallow it. We forget. We move on. This discussion is over. It never happened. He chose the town's opinion over his wife's soul. He chose the smooth, untroubled surface of our lives over the jagged, bleeding reality of my trauma. He looked at my shattered pieces and decided it was easier to sweep them under the rug than to help me put them back together. That night, something inside me died. The monster next door had violated my body, but the man in my bed, my husband, had annihilated my spirit. Frank Miller became the lesser of two evils. He was a predator, an animal acting on a monstrous nature. But Robert was my protector, my partner, my other half. And he had willingly, deliberately sacrificed me to preserve his own comfort and reputation. The true betrayal wasn't sleeping in the house next door. The true betrayal was sleeping right there, in my bed. And from that moment on, the silence he demanded became a living thing, a third person in our marriage, a cold and suffocating presence that would follow us for the rest of our days. In the months that followed the violation, my body began to write its own grim testament. It started not as a shout, but as a whisper from deep within. A dull, persistent ache in my abdomen that felt less like pain and more like a presence. It was a weight, a density that hadn't been there before. The first time I saw a doctor, a man named Henderson with tired eyes and a practiced, placating smile, he listened with half an ear as I described the sensation. "It feels full," I tried to explain, my hands hovering over my stomach, unable to touch the spot. "Occupied. Like something has taken up residence and won't leave." He nodded slowly, scribbling on his notepad. "Cramping? Bloating?" "Yes," I said, relieved for a moment that he was using clinical words. It made it feel less like madness. "All the time. It never really goes away." He leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning in protest. "Lily," he began, and the way he used my first name felt like a dismissal, a pat on the head. "You're a healthy woman. All your tests have come back perfectly normal. Blood work is clear. Physical exam shows nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us. Stress has a powerful way of manifesting physically, especially in women." He didn't say women of your age, but it hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. The unspoken suggestion was that my body was winding down, becoming unreliable, prone to fantasy. He gave me a prescription for a mild sedative and a pamphlet on managing anxiety. I left his office feeling smaller than when I'd entered, the phantom weight inside me feeling heavier than ever. The seasons turned. The ache remained, It became the new normal, the bass note to the melody of my days. I learned to move around it, to breathe around it, but it was always there, a constant low-level thrum of wrongness. I saw another doctor a year later, in a neighboring town, hoping for a fresh perspective. This one was younger, more arrogant. He didn't even bother with the pretense of sympathy. After a perfunctory examination, he tossed his gloves in the bin and declared, "It's psychosomatic." The word landed like a stone. Classic case. There is nothing physically wrong with you, Mrs. Davies. Your body is simply reflecting a distressed mental state. He then had the audacity to murmur to his nurse, just loud enough for me to hear, "Textbook female hysteria." Hysteria. The word was a cage. It was the diagnosis given to women for centuries when their pain was inconvenient, when their truths were unspeakable. They had branded me with it, dismissed the physical reality of my trauma as a figment of a weak female imagination. I wanted to scream, to grab him by his starched white coat and tell him that a monster had planted this sickness in me, that it was as real as the linoleum floor beneath my feet. But Robert's words echoed in my head, a ghostly shackle. We are the bigger people. We forget. This ends here. So I said nothing. I just nodded, paid my bill, and walked out into the cold afternoon air, the phantom child inside me kicking with a fresh wave of nausea. That's what I called it, in the privacy of my own mind. It was Frank's child of truth, a grotesque phantom pregnancy of trauma. I hadn't been given a child of love and hope, but a parasitic growth of violation. I was its unwilling host, its living incubator. It had no heartbeat, no form, but it had a life. It lived in the cramps that would double me over in the middle of the night. It lived in the sudden, inexplicable bloating that made my dresses feel tight and suffocating. It lived in the constant dull pressure against my spine. It was the physical manifestation of the secret Robert forced me to keep, a living, breathing testament to my silence. The most exquisite form of torture, however, wasn't physical. It was the performance of normalcy. Every Sunday, I would put on my best dress, style my hair, and walk into the First Community Church of Willow Creek on Robert's arm. And every Sunday, I would see Frank Miller. He was an usher. He would stand by the great oak doors, his face a perfect mask of solemn piety, handing out bulletins with a gentle smile. "Morning, Lily, Robert," he'd say, his voice smooth and warm, the same voice that had whispered my damnation in his cold, sterile basement. I would force a smile back, my lips feeling like cracked porcelain. I would take the paper from his hand, my skin crawling at the brief, incidental contact, and walk to our usual pew. During the service, I'd watch him. I'd watch him pass the polished brass collection plate. People would drop in their folded bills, their loose change, and they'd smile at him. They saw Frank Miller, the grieving widower, the pillar of the community, the kind neighbor. I saw the monster. I saw the man who had filled me with this invisible sickness. As he moved down the aisle, the plate extended. His eyes would sometimes meet mine. There was never a flicker of recognition, no hint of shared knowledge, just a calm, empty benevolence. It was in those moments that the thing inside me felt most active, a coil of cold dread tightening in my gut. He was a master of his craft, not just with his hidden laboratory, but with his public life. He had made his crime so completely my own that he could stand 10 feet away from me in the house of God and feel nothing but self-satisfaction. I was carrying his truth, just as he said I would. I was a walking, talking, smiling tomb, and the ghost of the crime was not in the past. It was a living, growing part of my present, a constant physical passenger on my journey through a life that was no longer my own. Our marriage, once a thing of genuine, if quiet, affection, curdled into a long, elaborate piece of theater. For the benefit of Willow Creek, Robert and I were the Davieses. We were stable, dependable. We attended town picnics. We hosted Christmas Eve drinks for the neighbors. We waved from our porch on warm summer evenings. Robert would put his arm around my shoulder, a proprietary gesture that felt less like affection and more like a guard keeping a prisoner in line. I would smile, a carefully constructed expression that didn't reach my eyes. Our home became the stage for this play, and we were its two lonely actors performing for an audience that wasn't there. The moment the front door closed, the curtain fell. The silence that rushed in to fill the space, was no longer peaceful. It was immense, suffocating, and weighted with the gargantuan mass of the thing we never, ever spoke of. It sat at the dinner table with us, an invisible third guest. Robert would read the newspaper, the rustle of the pages, a frantic attempt to fill the void. I would push food around my plate, the phantom ache in my belly making every bite feel like a chore. The food had no taste. The coffee was never hot enough. The world had been leached of its flavor. We stopped sleeping in the same bed a year after the incident. I had started waking up screaming, the nightmares so vivid they clung to me like a shroud long after I was conscious. One night, a particularly visceral dream had me thrashing, and I accidentally struck Robert in the face. He didn't get angry. He didn't comfort me. He just got up, took his pillow and blanket, and moved into the guest room. He never moved back. There was no discussion. It was just another silent decree, another brick in the wall he was building between us. From then on, our house was a map of our separation. His room, my room, his chair, my chair. We moved through the same space like ghosts, careful not to brush against each other, our paths diverging to avoid any possibility of collision. My world shrank. I stopped going to my book club, feigning headaches. I let my garden club membership lapse. Conversations felt like navigating a minefield. The polite chatter of the town, who was getting married, who had a new baby, who was renovating their kitchen, all felt like a foreign language. How could I speak of such trivial things when I was carrying a screaming abyss inside me? My voice began to feel rusty from disuse. I spoke only when necessary, my words clipped and functional. The mail is here. We need milk. Good night, Robert. He seemed to accept this change as part of our unspoken pact. My withdrawal, my silence, was proof that I was being the bigger person, that I was holding up my end of the bargain. He mistook my catatonia for compliance, but he was wrong. In the deep, frozen winter of my soul, one tiny, defiant seedling was pushing its way through the frost. It was the garden. Specifically, the long shared property line between our house and Frank Miller's. It was marked by a simple, low-wire fence, a neighborly demarcation that suggested openness and community. That fence became my obsession. It was a scar on the land, a daily reminder of the proximity of my tormentor. One spring, I decided I couldn't look at it anymore. I didn't go to the local nursery and buy cheerful daisies or forgiving petunias. I drove 2 towns over and found a specialist grower. I spent hours walking through their greenhouses, searching for something specific. I found it in a section labeled Hardy Climbers. I bought a dozen plants of a variety called Crimson Rampart. The name alone felt like a small victory. They were climbing roses, but not the delicate, fragrant kind you see in bridal bouquets. These were aggressive, vicious. Their canes were thick as my thumb and studded with hooked, cruel-looking thorns that would snag and tear at the slightest touch. The flowers themselves were a deep, bloody red, almost black at the center, and they bloomed with a wild, untamable fury. That weekend, while Robert was at a golf tournament and Frank was, I assumed, polishing his mask of decency for the next church service, I began my work. I dug a trench along the entire length of that fence line. The work was brutal. The ground was hard and full of rocks. My hands, soft from years of light housework, were soon blistered and raw, but the pain was good. It was real. It was a pain I had chosen, a pain I could control. As I dug, I channeled all the silent, screaming rage that had been festering inside me for years. Each shovelful of dirt was a word I couldn't speak. Each rock I pried from the earth was a tear I couldn't cry. I planted those roses with a reverence I usually reserved for prayer. I mixed the soil with nutrients, untangled their roots, and positioned each one carefully, weaving their thorny, nascent canes through the links of the wire fence. By the time I was done, my back ached, my arms were covered in long, angry scratches from the thorns, and I was caked in mud. I stood back, looking at my work. It was just a line of small, struggling plants. But to me, it was the first sentence of a declaration of war. Over the next few years, I tended to that hedge with a fierce devotion. It was my only act of rebellion, my one true private thing. I fed it, watered it, and pruned it to encourage the most aggressive growth. The roses thrived, They grew into a dense, impenetrable wall of beautiful, sharp things. They devoured the wire fence, transforming it from a symbol of openness into a formidable barrier. The blood-red flowers bloomed in defiant clusters, and the thorns stood guard, gleaming in the sunlight. Sometimes I would see Frank in his yard, and he would look over at the hedge. He never said anything, but I imagined he saw just a lovely, if slightly overgrown rosebush. He couldn't see the truth of it. He couldn't see that every thorn was a shard of my rage, that every flower was a drop of my unshed blood. It was a pathetic defense, I knew. A wall of thorns couldn't undo what had been done. It couldn't heal the sickness inside me or bridge the silent chasm in my marriage. But it was mine. In a life that had been stolen from me, a life dictated by the cowardice of one man and the cruelty of another, that hedge was the one thing I had built myself. It was my secret, my sanctuary, and my warning. It was the only voice I had left. Decades passed in this suspended state of silent anguish. The thorny hedge grew thick and tall. The phantom in my womb became a familiar, if unwelcome, companion. Robert and I perfected our roles, our performance so seamless that I sometimes wondered if the happy couple we pretended to be had more substance than the two empty shells rattling around inside our house. Time didn't heal the wound, it simply turned it into a chronic condition. Then, one Tuesday morning in late autumn, the play came to an abrupt end. I was in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes when I heard a heavy thud from the living room. It wasn't a dramatic sound, just a dull, final sort of impact. I turned off the water, my hands still soapy, and walked into the other room. Robert was on the floor, lying next to his armchair. The newspaper was scattered around him like fallen leaves. His face was a placid, grayish color, and his eyes were open, staring at a spot on the ceiling. There was no panic, no rush of adrenaline, just a profound and sudden quiet. The silence in the house had finally won. It had swallowed him whole. I knelt beside him, my knees cracking on the hardwood floor. I knew, with a certainty that was as deep and cold as a well, that he was gone. A heart attack, the paramedics would later say. Quick, probably painless. For a moment, I felt nothing at all, just a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a scene from a movie. The man who had been the architect of my silent prison, my warden, and my fellow inmate, was dead. The days that followed were a blur of prescribed rituals. The funeral home, the casket selection, the phone calls to distant relatives. People came and went, their faces etched with practiced sympathy. They brought casseroles and pies, their voices low and respectful. Frank Miller came to the funeral. He shook my hand, his grip firm and dry, and looked me in the eye. "I am so terribly sorry for your loss, Lily," he said, his voice thick with false sincerity. "Robert was a good man, a true friend. If there's anything at all you need, you know where I am." I just nodded, the words catching in my throat. The sheer monumental hypocrisy of it almost made me laugh. After the last of the mourners had left and the house was finally mine, I began the slow, methodical process of dismantling the life we had built together. I started with his closet. The scent of him, cedar, Old Spice, and something uniquely Robert, clung to his suits and shirts. I packed them into boxes for donation, my movements mechanical, my mind blessedly blank. I sorted through his papers, his books, his collection of ship models. It was like an archaeological dig through a life of carefully curated quiet. It was in the very back of the closet, tucked behind a stack of old tax returns and a box of winter boots, that I found it. A small, gray metal box, no bigger than a book. It was heavy for its size and locked with a simple, integrated keyhole. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't something we'd ever used. My heart, which had been beating with a slow, funereal rhythm for days, began to thud against my ribs with a new, unfamiliar urgency. My hands trembled as I carried it into the light of the bedroom. There was no key. Of course there was no key. I took it to the fireplace and, with a strength I didn't know I possessed, I took the heavy iron poker and wedged it into the seam of the lid. I pried and twisted. The metal groaned in protest. Then with a sharp, ugly screech, the lock broke and the lid popped open. I peered inside, my breath held tight in my chest. I didn't know what I expected to find: a letter of confession, a hidden stash of money, an apology written on a yellowed piece of paper. But there was none of that. The box was almost empty. Nestled in a bed of faded black velvet was a single, small object, a black and gray plastic canister. I lifted it out. It was light, almost weightless. I knew what it was instantly. The label, though faded, was still legible. Kodak Tri-X Pan 400. It was a roll of 35mm film, undeveloped. I sank onto the hearth, the small canister cold in my palm. It felt impossibly heavy, a dense singularity of secrets. My mind reeled. Robert, the man who demanded silence, who insisted we forget, who built our life on the foundation of a buried truth. Robert, who had turned his back on me. He had been watching. He hadn't been ignoring Frank. He hadn't been forgetting. He had been documenting. From a window, from the yard, the images flooded my mind. Robert, peering through a telephoto lens, his face a mask of grim determination, secretly capturing. What? Frank in his workshop. Frank meeting with someone? The possibilities were dizzying, terrifying, and electrifying. This roll of film was not an apology. It was something far more potent. It was evidence. A secret he had kept not just from the world, but from me. For the first time in 30 years, since the moment Robert had pronounced my sentence in our living room, a flicker of something ignited deep within the cold, dormant landscape of my soul. It was a tiny, dangerous, brilliant spark. It was hope. The tomb he had built around my life, the silent, airless prison we had shared, suddenly had a crack in it. A thin sliver of light was piercing the darkness. The phantom inside me, the child of truth, stirred not with pain, but with a sharp, fierce jolt of anticipation. The story wasn't over. Robert had left behind one final, unspoken word, and I was going to find out what it was. After Robert was gone, the house settled into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of our shared life, but a thin, brittle quiet that seemed to vibrate with unearthed possibilities. I found myself walking through rooms not as a ghost, but as an archaeologist, sifting through the layers of my own life. It was during this sifting that I found the metal box, and inside it, the small, unassuming canister of film. A key Robert had kept hidden, now in my hand. But a key to what door? I didn't know. I only knew that for the first time in nearly half a century, I felt the faint stirring of a question, rather than the dead weight of an answer I was forced to accept. The canister sat on my bedside table, a silent sentinel, while the ghost inside me continued its relentless, grinding work. The pain, my constant companion, chose that week to escalate. It was no longer a dull ache or a phantom pressure. It was a hot, insistent agony that radiated from my core, a fire banked for decades that now threatened to consume the kindling of my old bones. My family doctor, a man my own age who had patted my hand for 30 years and prescribed platitudes, had finally retired to Florida. His replacement was a name on a letter from the clinic, Dr. Eris Thorne. Walking into his office was like stepping into a different century. The room was bright, minimalist, with abstract art on the walls instead of dusty medical diagrams. And he was young, frighteningly young. He had kind, dark eyes and a way of listening that was so complete, so focused, it felt like a physical touch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scribble notes while I spoke, his gaze fixed on a prescription pad. He simply watched my face, his own expression a study in concentration. I recited the familiar litany, the story I had told a dozen doctors before him. The phantom swellings, the persistent, unlocatable pain, the feeling of being occupied. I watched for the usual signs, the subtle glaze in the eyes, the slight, condescending tilt of the head, the polite smile that was a mask for dismissal. I waited for the inevitable words, psychosomatic, stress, grief, hysteria, but they never came. When I finished, the room was quiet. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, his fingers steepled. He had my file on his desk, a ridiculously thick manila folder bulging with 40 years of medical dead ends. He hadn't opened it yet. "Mrs. Peterson," he began, his voice calm and even. Lily, may I call you Lily? I nodded, caught off guard. Lily, he repeated softly. I want to be very clear. I believe you. I believe you are in pain. The fact that no one has been able to give your pain a name doesn't make it any less real. Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and sudden. I blinked them back furiously. I had not cried in front of a doctor since I was 38. It was a weakness I had long since beaten out of myself. He pushed the thick file forward with 2 fingers, a gesture of distaste. This is a history of medicine failing to listen to a woman. That's what this file is. 40 years of unexplained chronic pain is not hysteria. It is not grief. It's a mystery. It's a puzzle that, for whatever reason, no one has been dedicated enough to solve. He finally opened the folder and began to flip through the pages, his frown deepening with each report he scanned. X-rays, barium swallows, psychiatric evaluations. A chronicle of my humiliation. They ran every test they could think of in the 70s and 80s, he murmured, more to himself than to me. But the technology, it was limited. They were looking for a shadow, but maybe they were using the wrong kind of light. He looked up, his gaze direct and serious. I am not my predecessors, Lily. I don't believe in ghosts in the machine, but I do believe in hidden truths. There is a procedure, an exploratory laparoscopy. It's minimally invasive. We make a small incision, and we use a high-definition camera to look, to actually see what's going on inside, to map the territory that has been causing you this pain for most of your life. A camera, to look inside. The word sent a tremor through me. For 40 years, the monster had been mine alone, a secret tenant in the dark. The idea of exposing it to the light, of another human being seeing my private horror, was terrifying. But the alternative was another 10, 20 years of this. Of the silence, the pain, the gnawing certainty that I was a living tomb. Robert's voice echoed in my mind, a faint, reedy whisper from the past. We must be the bigger people. We forget. I looked at Dr. Thorne, at his earnest, intelligent face, a face free from the cynicism of my generation. He was offering not a cure, but a chance at a diagnosis. He was offering to look for the truth. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but firm. I'll do it. He gave me a small, reassuring smile. Good. It's time for someone to look inside. It's long past time. I went home feeling hollowed out, but in a new way. It wasn't the familiar emptiness of despair, but the clean, scoured feeling of a space being prepared. That night, I picked up the film canister from my bedside table. Its weight felt different in my hand now. It was no longer just a relic of Robert's secrets. It was a potential piece of my own puzzle, a piece of the map Dr. Thorne was about to draw. A few days later, the scent of lavender and old paper filled the house as my granddaughter Sarah arrived. She was a whirlwind of youthful energy and sharp, legal-minded pragmatism, a combination I found both exhausting and exhilarating. She had her father's kind eyes, but my stubborn jaw. In her, I saw a version of the woman I might have become if my life had not been so brutally diverted. Grandma, seriously, what is all this stuff? She asked, pulling a dusty box of Robert's old Kiwanis Club awards from the top of a wardrobe. Do you want to keep a plaque for Most Enthusiastic Pancake Flipper 1982? I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that startled us both. Your grandfather took his pancakes very seriously. Clearly, she said, her smile warm. But maybe we can create a greatest hits box instead of keeping the entire back catalog. We worked for hours, sorting through the detritus of a long life. Old suits that smelled of mothballs, stacks of National Geographic, tangled fishing lures. Amidst the comforting normalcy of it all, the film canister on my dresser felt like a tiny, dormant bomb. Sarah, with her quick, observant eyes, noticed me glancing at it. What's that? She asked, wiping a smudge of dust from her cheek. My heart began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It was now or never. I had the ally in the hospital. Did I have one in my own family? It was your grandfather's, I said, my voice tight. I picked it up and held it out to her. My hand was trembling. I found it in a locked box after he passed. It's a roll of 35mm film. It's never been developed. Sarah took it, her brow furrowed in curiosity. She turned the small metal object over in her fingers. Weird. Grandpa Robert wasn't exactly a photography buff, was he? I thought all his pictures were blurry Polaroids of his prize-winning roses. He wasn't, I confirmed. That's why I think it might be important. She looked from the canister to my face, and her expression shifted. The light-hearted, teasing granddaughter was gone, replaced by the sharp-witted law student who could sense a discrepancy, a detail that didn't fit the narrative. Okay, she said slowly. There's a 1-hour photo place still kicking at the mall. Let's go. I'll drive. The wait was excruciating. We sat in the food court, the smell of cheap pizza and cinnamon buns thick in the air. Sarah tried to make small talk, but I could barely respond. I felt as if I were awaiting a verdict. What had Robert seen? What had he known? Why would he take pictures and then hide them away for decades? Was this proof, or was it just another dead end, another path leading back to the same solitary confinement? When Sarah returned from the photo counter, she was holding a plain white envelope. She didn't open it. She just walked back to the table, her face pale and set. "Let's look at these at home," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The drive back to the house was silent. The air in the car was thick with unspoken tension. We sat at the old oak kitchen table, the same table where I'd served thousands of meals, where Robert had read his paper, where life had pretended to be normal for so long. Sarah slit the envelope open with a butter knife and slid the glossy prints out. The first few were duds. Black, blurry, completely indecipherable. My heart sank. Of course. Another failure. Then she laid down the fourth picture. It was grainy, dark, clearly taken at night, through a window pane streaked with rain or dirt. But the image was clear enough. It was a room, a workshop. But it wasn't the cozy, sawdust-strewn woodshop that Frank Miller had always shown off to the neighbors. This was something else entirely. It was sterile, cold. A metal table stood in the center of the room, gleaming under a harsh overhead light. On the wall behind it, I could see them, anatomical charts, not of animals, but of the human female reproductive system. On a tray next to the table were rows of gleaming instruments that looked surgical, along with racks of glass vials filled with dark, viscous liquids. It looked less like a handyman's hobby space and more like a private, terrifying laboratory. Sarah laid out the next photo, and the next. Different angles of the same room. A close-up of a strange, slender tool with a needle-like tip attached to a small bottle. A shot of open books with diagrams of cells and chemical formulas. My breath caught in my throat. Robert had seen this. He had stood outside Frank's window in the dead of night, armed with a camera, and he had documented this. And then he had locked the evidence away and told me to be the bigger person. The betrayal, fresh and sharp as the day it happened, twisted in my gut. Sarah stared at the photos, her legal mind processing, connecting. "This is Frank Miller's workshop," she stated, not a question. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. "Grandma," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she turned to face me. "What is this? What happened in that house?" And the dam broke. 40 years of silence, of swallowed screams and buried truths, came pouring out of me. I told her everything. The community party, the glass of lemonade, the cold basement floor. I told her about Frank's chilling words. "The duty of a woman is to carry things. Now you will carry my truth." I told her about stumbling home, bruised and violated, and telling Robert. And I told her about his reaction. The fear, the shame, the dismissal. His final, damning verdict. We forget. This ends here. I spoke for over an hour, my voice growing stronger, surer, with every secret I released. Sarah didn't move. She didn't flinch or look away. She just listened, her hands clenched into tight fists on the table, her eyes burning with an incandescent rage that was so pure, so righteous, It felt like a holy fire. When I finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, she reached across the table and took my trembling hands in hers. "I believe you," she said, her voice thick with emotion but absolutely steady. "I believe every single word, Grandma, and we are going to burn him to the ground." Her belief was a physical thing. It was a cool balm on a wound that had festered in the dark for 40 years. It was the first clean, healing touch I had felt since that night. In the fierce loyalty of my granddaughter's eyes, I saw not just an ally, but a warrior. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the silence was finally, truly over. We learned that Frank Miller, now 91 and deep in the fog of dementia, had been moved to a full-time care facility on the other side of the state 6 months prior. His house, the house next door, stood empty, a monument to a lifetime of secrets. The bank was handling the property, but it was a slow, bureaucratic process. It was a sitting target. "He can't be prosecuted," Sarah explained, her voice sharp with the clipped precision of a lawyer laying out the facts. We were in my living room, the horrifying photos spread across the coffee table like a tarot reading of my past. The statute of limitations for the assault ran out decades ago, and with his current mental state, he'd be deemed unfit to stand trial for anything, even if we could prove it. "So he gets away with it," I said, the words flat and bitter. "He gets away with it in a court of law," Sarah corrected, her eyes flashing. "But that doesn't mean he gets away with it. We don't know what he did, Grandma. Not really. Those words he said to you, 'You will carry my truth.' What does that mean? What did he do?" She gestured to the photos of the lab. "This wasn't just an assault. This was something else, something calculated, and the answers are in that house." The idea was terrifying. To willingly walk back into that place, the source of all my pain. But the fear was overshadowed by a new, powerful emotion, the burning need to know. The question Sarah had asked was the same one that had been a dull echo in the back of my mind for my entire adult life. What did he do to me? "The house is empty," she continued, her mind already working, planning. "The realtor puts the key in a lockbox from 9 to 5. But after that, security is a joke. A lonely old house nobody cares about yet. We could get in." "Break in?" The words felt foreign in my mouth. I was a 78-year-old woman who returned her library books on time. "Conduct a private investigation," Sarah countered, a wry smile touching her lips. "He violated you in the most horrific way imaginable. I think we're entitled to violate his privacy. We'll go after dark. Tonight." As dusk settled over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a strange calm descended upon me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. We dressed in dark clothes, 2 generations of women on a mission for truth. Sarah was all quiet competence, packing a small bag with flashlights, gloves, and a slim gym she'd bought online with a nonchalant, "You'd be surprised what you can get with 1-day shipping." The short walk next door felt like a journey across a barren wasteland. The familiar scent of my prize-winning roses, the ones that grew along the fence I had built as my only act of defiance, seemed to mock me. The Miller house was dark, its windows like vacant eyes. It looked smaller, sadder, than the fortress of my memory. Sarah worked on a back window with a startling efficiency. With a soft click, the lock gave way. "Law school is full of useful skills," she whispered, sliding the window open. She slipped inside first, then helped me clamber over the sill. The air inside was stale, thick with the dust of abandonment and the faint, cloying scent of decay. We moved silently through the dark rooms, our flashlight beams cutting through the gloom, revealing furniture shrouded in white sheets like rows of ghosts. We weren't interested in the house itself. Our destination was the workshop. It was in the basement, just as I remembered. The door at the top of the stairs was unlocked. As Sarah pushed it open, a wave of cold, sterile air washed over us, so different from the musty air in the rest of the house. It smelled of antiseptic and chemicals, a scent that my body recognized on a cellular level. I felt a tremor run through me, and Sarah's hand found mine in the dark, her grip firm and steady. We descended the wooden stairs, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. Sarah flicked on the main light switch, the room flooded with the same harsh white light I'd seen in Robert's photographs. It was exactly as the pictures had shown, only real and infinitely more terrifying. The metal table, the anatomical charts, the trays of surgical-looking tools. It was a place of meticulous, cold-blooded science. We began to search. We opened every drawer, every cabinet. We found more vials of chemicals, meticulously labeled with complex formulas. We found notebooks filled with observations on skin elasticity and cellular absorption rates. It was the work of a dedicated and deeply disturbed scientist. But we hadn't found what we were looking for. There was no confession, no neat explanation. "It has to be here," Sarah muttered, her frustration growing. She ran a gloved hand along a set of tall metal filing cabinets in the corner. She pulled one open. It was filled with files, just as you'd expect. Tax records, warranties, old bills. She slammed it shut. She tried the next one. The same. Then the third. It was locked. "This is it," she breathed. She pulled the Slim Jim from her bag, but the lock was too complex. Damn it! She looked around the workshop, her eyes scanning for a solution. Think, Grandma. Frank was meticulous, egotistical. He wouldn't hide the key somewhere random. It would be part of his system. My eyes drifted around the room, taking in the grotesque symmetry of it all. The tools laid out in perfect order, the charts on the wall. My gaze fell on a shelf above the main workbench. It held a row of taxidermy animals, Frank's publicly acknowledged hobby. A squirrel, a barn owl, a fox. They were masterpieces of their kind, lifelike and perfect. But there was one object that seemed out of place. It was a small, beautifully carved wooden hand, resting on a velvet pillow. "There," I whispered, pointing. "The hand." Sarah climbed onto the workbench and carefully lifted the object. Tucked into the palm, almost invisible, was a tiny, ornate silver key. Her hands were shaking slightly as she fitted the key into the lock of the filing cabinet. It turned with a satisfying, heavy thud. She pulled the drawer open. It wasn't filled with files. It was filled with a series of thick, leather-bound journals. Dozens of them, stacked neatly, each with a year embossed in gold on the spine. They spanned from 1955 to 2015. Sarah lifted the one marked 1978. She opened it to a random page. And we saw it, his handwriting. It was an elegant, terrifyingly beautiful cursive script, flowing across the page in perfect, measured lines. We sat down on the cold concrete floor, the single overhead bulb casting long, distorted shadows around us, and we began to read. It was a descent into a mind so brilliant and so twisted that it defied comprehension. He wrote of his wife's death not with grief, but with an intellectual frustration at the impermanence of the flesh. He, an expert taxidermist who could grant a beautiful, static immortality to animals, was enraged that he could not do the same for the person he claimed to love. He became obsessed with preservation, not of the body, but of truth, of memory. He believed memory could, and should, be made flesh. And then we found the entry, dated the day after the party. My name was there, written in his perfect looping script. Lily Peterson. "The subject is perfect," he wrote. "A physical echo of my dear departed Eleanor, but with a resilience, a vitality, that makes her an ideal vessel. The assault was a crude necessity, a means to an end. The true art, the real work, began after she was subdued." Sarah let out a choked sound, but I placed a hand on her arm, urging her to continue reading aloud. "The ink is my own formulation," he detailed, with the pride of an artist describing his materials. "A biological compound, derived from squid ink and combined with a proprietary blend of organic catalysts that allow it to bond with living tissue at a subdermal level. It is designed to be invisible to primitive imaging like X-rays and to fade over decades, becoming one with the host, a living document. The instrument," he went on, "is also my own design, a modified tattoo needle, pneumatically powered for precision and consistency, capable of inscribing text onto the most delicate of surfaces. The chosen canvas is the pinnacle of poetic justice. The uterus, the very seat of creation and secrets. A place no one would ever think to look. A woman's duty is to carry things. Life, burdens, secrets. She will now carry my masterpiece. My hand flew to my abdomen. The ghost, the phantom, the thing I had felt stirring inside me for 40 years. It had a name. It was ink. What? What did he write? I choked out. Sarah's face was a mask of cold fury as she read the final, devastating passage from that night. "It is my grand confession," he wrote, his script swelling with narcissistic pride. "A legacy hidden in plain sight. I have inscribed within her the truths that this pathetic little town is too cowardly to face. The details of the financial fraud that ruined the Bakers, a family of simple-minded bakers who trusted me with their life savings. The account of the blackmail I held over Mayor Thompson for his affair, which secured me decades of political protection. All my little masterpieces of manipulation etched into a permanent living record. She is my journal. She is my legacy. A work of art that will live and breathe and walk among them, and they will never, ever know. She is the keeper of my truth. It is my greatest work." We sat there in the suffocating silence of that sterile room, the open journal lying between us. The truth was more monstrous than anything I could have ever imagined. I was not just a victim of an assault. I had been turned into a living document, a canvas for a monster's ego. My body, my pain, my 40 years of silent suffering, it had been his art gallery. Sarah closed the journal, her movements stiff. She began to pack the journals into her bag, her face set like stone. We had our confession. And now, I had my surgery. The phantom was about to become flesh, and the world was about to see Frank Miller's masterpiece. The day of my surgery, the world seemed to be muffled, as if I were listening to it through a thick pane of glass. Sarah drove me to the hospital, her hand resting on the console between us, a small, solid point of contact in a sea of unreality. I wasn't scared. The fear had been burned out of me in that basement workshop. What remained was a strange, hollow calmness, a sense of finality. I was a book about to be opened. In the pre-op room, Dr. Thorne came to see me. He was all quiet professionalism, but I could see the curiosity, the intensity, in his eyes. He knew this was more than just a routine exploratory procedure. Sarah had called him the night we found the journals. She had explained in clipped, precise terms what we had found and what he should be looking for. He hadn't questioned it. He had simply listened and said, "I will find it." "Are you ready, Lily?" he asked gently. I looked from his face to Sarah's. Her expression was one of fierce, unwavering support. "I've been ready for 40 years, I replied, and my voice didn't tremble. They wheeled me into the operating room. It was cold, bright, and filled with the quiet hum of machinery. A nurse with kind eyes put a mask over my face and told me to count backwards from 10. I remember thinking, as the sweet chemical smell filled my lungs, that this was the second time a man had put me to sleep against my will. But this time, it was not to hide a secret. It was to reveal one. I closed my eyes at the number 7. My consciousness drifted, but the narrative of the room continued, relayed to me later by a shaken Dr. Thorne and an awestruck Sarah who had been allowed to watch from the observation booth. The procedure began. Dr. Thorne made the small, precise incision. He guided the laparoscope, the thin tube with the camera at its tip, into my body. On the large, high-definition monitor, the inner landscape of a human being appeared, pink and raw and alive. The medical team went about their work with practiced efficiency, their voices a low murmur of clinical observations. Exploring the peritoneal cavity, no visible adhesions, uterine surface appears normal. Dr. Thorne narrated, his voice calm. He maneuvered the camera, searching. For minutes, there was nothing but healthy tissue. A knot of tension formed in the observation booth where Sarah stood, her hands pressed against the glass. Was it possible Frank had lied? Was this another delusion? "Wait," Dr. Thorne said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Angle the light source by 15 degrees. Magnify 4x. The image on the screen zoomed in, the light shifting, and then the entire room fell silent. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. There it was. It was not bold or black like a modern tattoo. The ink had faded over the decades, sinking into the tissue, becoming a part of me. It was faint, like a watermark on old parchment, or a secret message revealed by a fire. But it was undeniably there. Swirling, intricate lines of elegant cursive script. A web of words woven into the very fabric of my body. It covered the surface of my organ, a sprawling, horrific tapestry of text. "My God," a nurse whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Thorne didn't speak. He just slowly, methodically, guided the camera across the entire surface, capturing every single word. The camera, with its unblinking digital eye, recorded everything. The financial crimes. The blackmail. The monster's full, gleeful confession, written in his own elegant hand, broadcast onto a 50-inch screen in a sterile operating room. The phantom I had carried for 40 years, the ghost that had haunted my every waking moment, was no longer a phantom. It was flesh. It was evidence. It was real. In the observation booth, Sarah began to cry. Not tears of sadness, but of profound, earth-shattering vindication. And somewhere, in the deep, dreamless twilight of anesthesia, I felt a shift, a lightening. The weight I had carried for so long, the burden of a truth no one else could see, was finally being lifted. The tomb had been opened. The ghost had been exposed to the light. The evidence, irrefutable and alive, was finally free. There would be no trial. The careful, measured words from Sarah's lawyer friend had settled in the air between us like dust, final and immovable. The statute of limitations, a legal term for a clock that had run out decades ago, had passed. Frank Miller, a hollowed-out vessel of a man adrift in the fog of his own mind, was no longer fit to stand before a judge. A court's justice, the kind that came with gavels and sentences, was a ship that had sailed without me. But I hadn't survived for 50 years, carrying a ghost inside me, for that kind of justice. I didn't need a courtroom. I needed a reckoning, my own. The drive to the nursing home was a silent film playing outside the car windows. Willow Creek, the town I had called home my entire life, looked alien. Every manicured lawn seemed to hide a secret. Every curtained window felt like an eye watching. Sarah drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Beside me on the seat, the tablet was cool and heavy, a slab of modern stone on which new commandments had been written. My commandments. "Are you sure, Grandma?" Sarah's voice was a gentle ripple in the car's heavy silence. "We don't have to do this. We have the proof. We can just release it." I looked at my own hands, resting in my lap. They were spotted with age, the skin thin as parchment, but they were steady. For the first time in as long as I could remember, they were not trembling. "Oh, we'll release it, sweetheart," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "But first, he has to see it. He has to know that I know. All of it. I wasn't doing this for the town or for a jury. I was doing this for the 28-year-old girl he had left on a cold basement floor, the girl who had been silenced not once, but twice. I was doing this for her." The Willow Creek Serene Meadows nursing home smelled of bleach, boiled cabbage, and a faint, cloying sweetness I couldn't place. It was the smell of waiting. The air was thick with it. We walked down a long linoleum hallway, the fluorescent lights humming a dreary, monotonous tune. We passed residents parked in wheelchairs in the hallway, their heads lolled to one side, their eyes fixed on a distant private horizon. Some watched us pass with a flicker of curiosity, but most were lost in their own fading worlds. This was where monsters came to die, not in a blaze of judgment, but in a slow, quiet fizzle of incontinence and forgotten memories. Frank was in the common room, parked in front of a television blaring a game show. He was a shrunken thing, a marionette with its strings cut. The robust, confident man who had dominated my nightmares was gone, replaced by this frail shell, lost in a cheap vinyl armchair. His head was bald except for a few wisps of white hair, and his skin was a pale, almost translucent canvas stretched over sharp bones. He wore a faded blue cardigan, a small stain of what looked like applesauce on the collar. He didn't look up as we approached. His eyes, cloudy with cataracts, were fixed on the bright, flashing screen. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over my arm. "Grandma?" I gave her a small, firm nod and stepped forward, blocking the television. I knelt down, my old knees protesting, so that I was at his eye level. "Hello, Frank?" His head turned slowly, a creak of rusted gears. Confusion swam in his pale eyes. He blinked, trying to place me. "Do I know you?" His voice was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across pavement. "You knew me once," I said softly. I glanced at Sarah, who understood immediately. She turned on the tablet, the screen glowing to life in the dim room. She held it in front of him. I didn't need to look at the screen. The images were seared into my soul. First, the video, the disorienting internal journey of the endoscope. The sickly green light illuminating the walls of my own body, a landscape no one was ever meant to see. The camera pans, slowly, methodically, guided by Dr. Thorne's skilled hand, and then they appear, faint, like a watermark on old paper, but unmistakable, the spidery, elegant script tattooed onto the very fabric of my being. Words, sentences, a confession written in a bio-ink masterpiece of cruelty. Frank's eyes, which had been vacant, began to focus. His brow furrowed. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not just confusion anymore. Recognition. Sarah swiped the screen. The video was replaced by high-resolution photographs of his journals, the pages we found in his workshop, his neat, precise handwriting filling page after page, schematics for his custom-made needle, chemical formulas for the ink he designed to be a permanent biological archive. And the words, the damning words, detailing his other, lesser sins, the financial deceptions, the blackmail that had built his comfortable life, all before the triumphant description of his final project. Me. I watched his face. The fog was receding, the clouds in his eyes were parting, and for a terrifying, validating moment, the man I remembered was looking back at me. The arrogance, the clinical pride, the monster. A dry, rattling cough escaped his chest. It was almost a laugh. His chapped lips peeled back from his teeth in something that resembled a smile. He lifted a trembling, skeletal finger and pointed at the tablet. "My magnum opus," he rasped, the words thick but clear. His eyes met mine, and they were shining with a horrid, lucid light. Permanent, a perfect secret, hidden in plain sight. There it was. The confession I had waited 50 years to hear. Not of the physical violation, but of the deeper, more twisted crime. The branding of my soul. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a profound and serene power that pushed away all the fear, all the shame. This was the moment, the closing of the circle. I leaned in closer, my face just inches from his. My voice was no longer the soft, gentle tone of an old woman. It was iron. It was the culmination of every silent scream, every swallowed tear. I was told, for a very long time, that I had to be the bigger person, Frank, I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the cheerful din of the game show. I think my husband meant I should be small, that I should shrink myself to accommodate your crime, that I should swallow your poison and pretend it was water. I spent 50 years trying to understand his words, trying to live inside them. And I did. I made myself a tomb for your secret. I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. His momentary lucidity was holding. He was listening. He was understanding. But I finally understand what it really means to be the bigger person, I continued. It doesn't mean shrinking. It means expanding. It means making yourself large enough to hold the truth, no matter how heavy it is. I was big enough to carry your masterpiece, Frank. I carried it through pregnancies, through doctor's appointments, through Sunday sermons where I had to look at your face. I carried it while I raised my children and buried my husband. I was a living archive of your evil. I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes now. The pride was curdling into fear. And now, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a final definitive judgment. Now I am big enough to give it away. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest. I took the tablet from Sarah's hands and turned it off. The screen went black, plunging his face back into the dim, stale light of the nursing home. The monster was gone again, the fog rolling back in. His eyes went vacant, his mouth fell slightly open, and he turned his head slowly back toward the blaring television. The moment of clarity shattered. He was gone, lost again in the labyrinth of his decaying mind. It was enough. He had seen. He had known. Sarah and I walked out of the nursing home without looking back. We didn't speak in the car. There was nothing left to say. When we got back to my house, the silence was different. It wasn't heavy and oppressive anymore. It was light. It was empty space, waiting to be filled with something new. That night, Sarah sat at my small kitchen table, her laptop open. The glow illuminated her determined face. She created a secure, anonymous email account. She meticulously compiled everything into a digital package. The high-definition surgical video, the scanned pages of Frank's journals, the crisp digital copies of the photographs Robert had taken all those years ago, the grainy, damning proof of Frank's workshop. She attached a short, clear-eyed summary of the story. My story. She had 2 recipients lined up, the state's largest, most respected newspaper, and a national investigative journalism website known for breaking the stories no one else would touch. Her finger hovered over the mouse. She looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I simply nodded. With a quiet click, she hit send. In the stillness of my kitchen, it sounded like a starter pistol firing at the beginning of a race. The secret was no longer mine to carry. It was out in the world, a seed of truth planted in the digital soil, waiting to break through the surface. We didn't have to wait long. The first call came 2 days later from a reporter at the state paper. His voice was a mixture of shock and professional hunger. He asked questions, and for the first time, I answered them. All of them. Without shame, without hesitation. My voice didn't waver. The story exploded on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't just a story. It was a detonation that sent shockwaves through the quiet, manicured streets of Willow Creek. The headline on the front page of the paper, in thick black letters, read, "The Monster Next Door, Beloved Community, Elder's Secret Confession Tattooed on Victim's Body." Willow Creek's perfect, placid facade didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. My phone began to ring, a shrill, incessant demand. At first, it was reporters from all over the country. Then it was the townspeople. Cars began to drive slowly past my house, the occupants staring as if it were a macabre tourist attraction. The whispers followed me to the grocery store, the post office. I saw old acquaintances cross the street to avoid me, their faces tight with a strange mixture of pity and accusation. I had done the unthinkable. I had aired the town's dirty laundry. I had proven that the perfect, safe little world they had built for themselves was a lie. The rot wasn't somewhere else. It had been living right next door, serving on church committees and waving from his porch. But then, something else began to happen. The backlash was loud and public, but the support was quiet and profound. A casserole dish appeared on my front porch, no note attached. A woman my age, who I'd known peripherally for decades, caught my eye in the pharmacy line and gave me a long, slow nod of solidarity, her eyes saying what her mouth could not. Another woman stopped me by the frozen foods, her hand briefly touching my arm. "My father," she began, then her voice broke. "Thank you," she whispered, and hurried away. Well, I was not the only one in Willow Creek with a story of silence. I had just been the one to finally break it. A week after the story broke, the nursing home called. Frank Miller was dead. He had passed in his sleep. His name, once a pillar of the community, was now and forever a synonym for monster. There was no grand funeral, no eulogies praising his generosity. He was buried quietly, his legacy not one of benevolence, but of a unique and monstrous cruelty. With Frank's death, a chapter closed. But one final act of reclamation remained. Dr. Thorne had already scheduled the surgery. A hysterectomy, the final physical removal of Frank's magnum opus, lying on the gurney, being wheeled into the cold, bright operating room. I wasn't scared. I felt a sense of profound peace. I was not losing a part of myself. I was evicting a squatter, cleansing the temple. When I woke up, groggy from the anesthesia, the first thing I did was slowly, carefully, push back the thin hospital blanket. Across my lower abdomen was a line of clean, white dressing. Beneath it, I knew, was a scar, but this scar was different. It wasn't a mark of violation. It was a clean, honest line drawn by a healer's hand. It was a seam, stitching me back together. It was the mark of a survivor. I traced the line through the bandage. I was no longer a living vessel for his crimes. The archive was closed. The tomb was empty. The following spring, as the world outside my window burst into a riot of green, I stood in my garden with Sarah. The air was warm, smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. For 50 years, the border between my property and Frank's had been defended by a thick, thorny wall of climbing roses. They had been my only act of defiance, a beautiful but hostile barrier. They were gone now. I had torn them down myself, the thorns scratching my arms, the effort leaving me breathless but exhilarated. In their place, the earth was turned and dark. We had bags of seeds and young vegetable starters at our feet. Carrots, tomatoes, lettuce, zucchini, things that grew from the ground, that offered nourishment, life. I plunged a small trowel into the soft soil. It felt right. My hands, once symbols of my powerlessness, were now tools of creation. "This feels better," Sarah said, kneeling beside me, pressing a tiny tomato plant into a hole she'd dug. "It is better," I said, a real smile spreading across my face. I looked at the open space where the roses had been, at the neighbor's house, now just a house. It held no power over me. I spent so long hiding. I think I'm done with that now. I want to grow things out in the open. We worked all afternoon, our hands covered in dirt, the sun warm on our backs. We were not planting a barrier. We were planting a future. As the months passed, the quiet in my house became a comfortable blanket. The ghosts were gone, but one remained, a gentler, more complicated spirit. Robert. The anniversary of his death approached, a date that had always been shrouded in a fog of unspoken grief and resentment. This year, I knew, had to be different. On the evening of the anniversary, I sat at the old oak desk in the study, the one that had been his. I took out a single sheet of my best stationery, the creamy, heavy kind I saved for important letters, and my favorite fountain pen. The room was still, the only sound the scratch of the nib on paper. I began to write. My dearest Robert. It has been 4 years since you left. In some ways, it feels like a lifetime. In others, like you were just in this room yesterday, reading your paper. I am writing to you tonight because there are things I need to say, things I should have said a long, long time ago. The silence in this house is finally just silence, Robert. It is no longer filled with the weight of what we never spoke of. I know now. I know everything. After you were gone, I found the box, the one you kept locked in your closet. I found the roll of film. Sarah had it developed for me. I saw the pictures you took, Robert. The blurry, secret photos of Frank's workshop, taken through his window in the dead of night. You knew, or at least, you suspected. You saw the surgical tools, the chemicals. You knew he wasn't just a friendly neighbor who was good with his hands. You saw the darkness, and instead of bringing it into the light, you locked it in a metal box. And I know what he did. All of it. I found his journals. Frank didn't just hurt me that night. He branded me. He used a needle of his own design and an ink of his own creation to tattoo a confession onto the walls of my womb. He called it his magnum opus, a permanent record of his sins hidden inside my body. For 50 years, that phantom pregnancy, That hysterical female pain the doctors dismissed was the truth, literally growing fainter inside me. That was the truth I tried to give you that night, and the truth you told me to bury. You told me to be the bigger person. I have spent my entire adult life turning that phrase over and over in my mind, trying to understand what you meant. For so long, I thought it meant to absorb the pain, to be a vessel for sorrow, to swallow the poison, and smile so as not to upset the delicate balance of our lives, of this town. I thought it meant to shrink, to make myself smaller and smaller until the secret could fit inside me without showing at the seams. I tried, Robert. I truly did. I became a walking ghost in our own home, and our marriage became a beautiful, empty house. But I was wrong. And you were wrong. That isn't what being the bigger person means. I learned the true meaning this year. Being the bigger person means you make yourself large enough to hold the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how heavy it is. It means you stand in the full light of what happened, and you do not flinch. It means you don't shrink from the ugliness in the world, or in the people you love. It means you bear witness. You did not have to carry my burden, Robert. That was never your responsibility. It was mine, and mine alone. But you only had to stand beside me while I carried my own. You only had to hold my hand. You only had to believe me. That is all I ever needed from you. I have set the truth free. The whole world knows what Frank Miller was. And I have set myself free. I had surgery. The part of me he claimed, the organ where he wrote his confession, is gone. I am clean. I am whole. I am no longer a tomb. I don't know if I forgive you. Forgiveness is a complicated word. Perhaps it's not for me to give, but I understand. I understand the fear that drove you. Fear of scandal, fear of ugliness, fear for the life you had so carefully built. You were a man of your time, and your time demanded silence from women like me. But I am a woman of my time now, and my time finally demands the truth. I am letting you go now, Robert. All of it. The pain, the resentment, the long years of silence. I am keeping the good memories, our wedding day, the birth of our children, the laughter we shared before the darkness fell. The rest, I am releasing. Yours, finally and truly, Lily. I folded the letter carefully, my hand steady. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. I carried the letter and a small tin can out to the back garden, where the new vegetable shoots were just beginning to push through the dark soil. The evening sky was a deep, bruised purple, dotted with the first faint stars. I placed the letter in the can and struck a match. The flame caught the corner of the paper, a bright orange tongue licking at the edges. The paper curled, turning black. My words, my final confession to him, turned to smoke. I watched as the gray ash drifted up into the vast open sky, disappearing into the twilight. And as the last ember died, I felt it, a final, definitive shift inside me. The last of the weight, the ghost of my husband's failure, the anchor of his fear. It lifted. It was gone. The air in my lungs felt lighter. The silence around me was pure and peaceful. I stood there for a long time, in my new garden, under the endless sky. I was not a wife. I was not a victim. I was not a secret keeper. I was just Lily, and I was free. My story is not just about the monster next door, but about the quiet betrayals that allow monsters to thrive. It took me a lifetime to find my voice, and I wonder how many other stories are still out there, waiting in the silence. Let me know in the comments what you think it truly means to be the bigger person in a situation like this.